April 7th, 1945. The sky above the East China Sea erupted into chaos. More than 400 American planes dove through clouds of smoke and flak toward a single target. Yamato, the largest, most powerful battleship ever built. Within hours, the pride of Japan, the unsinkable fortress, would vanish beneath the waves, taking over 3,000 souls with her. But Yamato's death wasn't just the end of a ship. It was the death of an era, a moment when brute strength met the future and lost. Her 18-inch guns, once symbols of unstoppable power, turned out to be her greatest curse. Why did the most powerful warship in history fall so helplessly? What secret doomed her before she ever fired her first shot? And how did her destruction change the course of naval warfare forever? This is the story of Yamato, the Leviathan that drowned in its own legend. If you love uncovering the hidden stories behind history's most iconic machines, make sure to hit like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to share this video with your friends who love military history or epic tales of courage and tragedy. Now settle in, because Yamato's story isn't just history. It's a haunting lesson written in steel and fire. The morning of April 7th, 1945, dawned gray and heavy over the East China Sea. The wind smelled of salt and smoke, and somewhere beyond the horizon, the faint rumble of distant thunder echoed, though it wasn't the weather. It was engines, hundreds of them. Beneath that ominous sky, the Japanese battleship Yamato cut through the waves like a drifting fortress, her massive hull displacing the ocean in rolling sheets of foam. She was a titan, 72,000 tons of steel, carrying 9 of the largest naval guns ever built. But on that morning, even the strongest ship on Earth seemed small. Overhead, unseen but drawing closer by the minute, wave after wave of American aircraft assembled. Avengers, Helldivers, Corsairs, 400 planes hunting a single target. The sea, the sky, and history itself were about to collide. Every man aboard Yamato knew it. They had enough fuel for only half a journey, one way, and yet not one turned back. From the bridge, Captain Kosaku Ariga stood silently, his face expressionless as the ship's wake trailed out like a scar behind them. Below him, gunners prepared the mighty 18-inch batteries, weapons so powerful that when fired, the blast could tear apart the ship's own float planes. The crew moved with the grim precision of men who had already made peace with death. Some wrote final letters folded carefully into oilskin pouches. Others whispered prayers to ancestors. The sea was calm, deceptively so, but tension vibrated through every bolt, every voice, every heartbeat. Then, at 12:20 p.m., the horizon erupted. American aircraft, black specks against the silver sky, appeared in swarms. The first bombs fell seconds later. Waterspouts rose like towers around Yamato as her gunners unleashed a storm of flak. The sky filled with fire and thunder, but the enemy was everywhere, coming from every direction. The Leviathan of the Pacific had awakened, and the sea began to burn. Torpedoes struck first. One after another, they slammed into Yamato's flanks with crushing force. The ship heeled violently, alarms blaring through steel corridors as men fought to seal flooded compartments. Smoke rolled through the passageways, thick and choking. On deck, the air reeked of cordite and fuel. Anti-aircraft guns roared, the sound deafening even through the chaos. Young sailors, barely 20, stood at open mounts, firing until the barrels glowed red. Some were blown away where they stood. Others kept shooting through flames and debris, driven not by orders but by sheer instinct to survive. The 18-inch guns, too large, too slow, were loaded with anti-aircraft shells, bursting above the clouds in fiery blossoms. It was a desperate act, a titan swiping at hornets. Yet still the bombers came, relentless, disciplined, merciless. Each explosion felt closer than the last, until even the ocean itself seemed to scream. By 2:00 p.m., Yamato was dying. Her engines faltered, her port side torn open by torpedoes. Fire swept through the gun decks. The great steel beast that once embodied an empire's pride now listed heavily to one side, crippled and bleeding into the sea. On the bridge, Captain Arriga stood at his post, refusing to abandon his ship. He gave his final order, to save as many as possible. Below, men scrambled toward the decks, only to find the sea aflame with burning oil. Those who leapt overboard were swallowed by fire. And then, at 2:23 p.m., Yamato's forward magazine detonated. The explosion was cataclysmic, a fireball so vast it reached 6 kilometers into the sky. The shockwave flattened nearby destroyers. The thunder rolled across the horizon like the sound of the world ending. When the smoke cleared, nothing remained but an oil slick and fragments of steel. The pride of Japan, the unsinkable fortress, was gone. Destroyed not by another battleship, but by the sky itself. The story of Yamato doesn't begin with steel or fire. It begins with fear. Fear of being caged, of being forgotten, of watching the rising sun sink beneath western shadows. In the aftermath of World War I, Japan stood tall among the victors, proud, confident, and hungry for recognition. It had proven itself on the world stage, modernized its navy, and conquered new territories. Yet beneath that pride simmered resentment. To the Western powers, Japan was never an equal, merely a guest at a table reserved for empires older and whiter. That wound deepened in 1922 when diplomats gathered in Washington, D.C. to shape the future of naval warfare. What emerged was the Washington Naval Treaty, an agreement meant to limit global arms races, but in Tokyo it felt like humiliation carved in ink. While the United States and Britain were allowed a naval tonnage ratio of 5-5, Japan was given only 3. 3! The newspapers fumed. As if Japan were a child at the adults' table. To admirals and politicians alike, the treaty was a chain, one that bound their dreams of maritime dominance. In smoke-filled offices and naval academies across Japan, a dangerous idea began to take root. Kai-Kessen, the decisive battle doctrine. The logic was simple, almost poetic in its simplicity. Japan could never match America ship for ship. But it didn't have to. If the Imperial Navy could lure the U.S. fleet across the vast Pacific and destroy it in one crushing, decisive engagement, Japan could force peace on its own terms. A single, perfect strike to secure the empire's destiny. This doctrine became a religion. Every cadet learned it. Every ship was built around it. And it was in service of that belief, that obsession, that the seeds of Yamato were planted. But before the great ship could be forged, Japan had to break its chains, and for that, it needed to cheat the limits that the treaty imposed. In secret, engineers began sketching designs that no one outside the empire was supposed to see. Battleships so enormous that no Western power would dare challenge them. The Washington Treaty forbade guns larger than 16 inches. Yamato's would be 18.1. It capped displacement at 35,000 tons. Yamato would weigh almost twice that. In the eyes of the Imperial Navy, it wasn't simply rebellion. It was retribution. By the early 1930s, Japan's ambitions were growing bolder and darker. The nation's industry thrived under military expansion, but so did its arrogance. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, defying the League of Nations. The international community condemned the act, and Japan, unbothered, withdrew from the League entirely. Isolation deepened. Economic sanctions and embargoes followed, feeding a sense of persecution and destiny. To the average citizen, this was no longer about politics. It was about survival. The West wanted to keep Japan small, weak, obedient. The emperor's duty, and that of every soldier and sailor, was to defy that fate. Propaganda painted the nation as a rising phoenix hemmed in by jealous powers. And in the heart of Japan's naval command, men whispered of a weapon that would restore the balance, a warship so vast, so powerful, that its very existence would strike fear across oceans. The Yamato project was born, wrapped in the highest secrecy, hidden even from most of Japan's own government. Blueprints were coded, shipyards disguised, and entire towns relocated to conceal the construction sites. In this atmosphere of suspicion and pride, the Imperial Japanese Navy became both a symbol and a shadow, admired by the public, yet haunted by the knowledge that time was running out. The world was changing faster than doctrine could follow. Aircraft carriers, once mere scouts for the battle fleet, were beginning to show their power. In 1935, naval exercises revealed something startling. Airplanes could find and sink battleships long before those ships ever saw their attackers. But the old guard refused to listen. "A battleship," one admiral declared, "can take 100 bombs and still fight. A carrier cannot take one shell." The statement would echo like prophecy, one proven catastrophically false within a decade. Still, pride triumphed over pragmatism. Japan's naval strategy turned inward, obsessed with perfection rather than adaptation. As diplomats clashed with Western powers and militarists tightened their grip at home, the empire began to drift toward inevitable conflict. The chains of the Washington Treaty were finally being shattered, not through negotiation, but through defiance. The ship that would do it, the Yamato, was already being drawn in secret, a steel mountain that would embody both Japan's pride and its blindness. By the late 1930s, the Pacific trembled with tension. Japan's war in China had escalated into a nightmare of stalemate and brutality. Western powers looked on in alarm, cutting off oil, iron, and other critical imports. Yet instead of retreating, Japan doubled down. It expanded its influence southward, reaching toward the oil-rich territories of the Dutch East Indies and the British colonies in Malaya. War was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty waiting for an excuse. And as the drums of conflict grew louder, construction began on the most ambitious warship ever conceived. Her name, Yamato, drawn from an ancient poetic term for Japan itself, was no accident. She was to be the living embodiment of the nation's spirit, the iron incarnation of divine destiny. The blueprints defied reason, 863 feet long, displacing 72,000 tons fully loaded, and armed with 9 guns each over 60 feet in length. Her armor was thick enough to shrug off anything the world could throw at her, or so her designers believed. Every bolt, every rivet, every weld was laid with a kind of reverence, as though they were building not a machine, but a god. Workers toiled behind walls of scaffolding and canvas, forbidden to speak of what they saw. American spies in China reported rumors of giant ships under construction in Kure and Nagasaki, but no proof ever surfaced. Japan had learned well how to hide its ambitions, until the day those ambitions would roar to life. And yet, beneath all the iron and secrecy, a fatal irony was taking shape. The world that Yamato was built to dominate no longer existed. By the time her keel was laid, the era of the battleship was already fading. Air power was rewriting the rules of war, and radar was changing how navies saw the sea. The Japanese, blinded by doctrine and pride, could not see that the age of massive guns and armor was dying before their very eyes. The Yamato, conceived as the key to Japan's victory, was in truth a monument to the past, an answer to a question no one was asking anymore. But to the men who designed her, to the admirals who dreamed of the decisive battle, she was destiny made real. They could not have known that the chains they sought to break would only be reforged, this time, not by treaties or treaties, but by history itself. In the end, those chains would drag Yamato and her crew to the ocean floor, where ambition met inevitability, and where pride sank under its own weight. In the quiet coastal city of Kure, nestled between misty hills and the calm waters of the Sato Inland Sea, something extraordinary was taking shape. To outsiders, the harbor looked unremarkable. Cranes, warehouses, and the usual bustle of shipbuilders at work. But beyond the high fences and watchtowers, an invisible secret pulsed through the air. Workers entered through guarded gates, their identification checked by stern-faced officers. No one spoke of what they saw inside. They were building something beyond imagination, a battleship so vast that even its blueprints seemed to defy reason. To the world, it didn't exist. To Japan, it was Project Number 1. Every detail of its construction was wrapped in layers of deception. Camouflage netting hung like vines over the slipway, tarps stretched across towering scaffolds, and entire neighborhoods were relocated to hide the ship's true size. To anyone flying overhead, it looked like a factory complex. But beneath those covers, a Leviathan of steel was slowly coming to life. The year was 1937, and Japan was already at war in China, its empire expanding, its confidence swelling. The naval command in Tokyo wanted a weapon that embodied that power, a declaration in steel that Japan would never again bow to Western dictates. The ship's name, whispered only among top engineers and admirals, was Yamato. Every plate of armor, every bolt, every rivet carried a purpose beyond mechanics, to prove that Japan could outbuild, outgun, and outlast the West. The scale of the project was staggering. Her hull alone stretched longer than 2 football fields. Her armor belt, thicker than 16 inches, could absorb direct hits from anything afloat. Her gun turrets, each weighing more than a destroyer, would house the largest naval cannons ever made, 18.1-inch guns, capable of firing shells the size of small cars. Each shell, over 6 feet tall and nearly 1.5 tons in weight, could travel 25 miles and punch through steel as thick as a locomotive. When engineers saw the first test firing of a prototype, the shockwave shattered windows half a mile away. It was, one naval observer later said, as if the gods themselves had spoken. But the gods demanded sacrifice. The construction of Yamato strained Japan's resources and its secrecy to the limit. The slipway was covered by a massive roof to hide her from American reconnaissance. Workers signed oaths of silence under penalty of imprisonment. Families who lived near the harbor were moved inland without explanation. Even within the Imperial Navy, few officers knew the full truth of what was being built. Engineers worked through nights lit by dim lamps, measuring, welding, shaping the skeleton of what would become the heaviest battleship ever to sail. Every design choice carried risk. To support her immense weight, the hull had to be reinforced with double framing. To move her, turbines of unprecedented power were required. To house her crew of 3,000, entire decks were reimagined. And through it all, the question lingered. Was this ship a masterpiece of engineering, or a monument to obsession? Still, the workers pressed on, their pride blinding them to the irony. They were crafting the most powerful battleship in a world that was learning to fight without them. By 1940, after 3 years of relentless labor, the great hull was finally ready for launch. Thousands gathered quietly along the shore as the massive shape slid into the water for the first time. It was a moment both triumphant and terrifying, the birth of a symbol, a titan of steel that seemed to defy nature itself. The crowd gasped as Yamato's bow cut through the waves, her black hull gleaming in the sunlight. She looked less like a ship and more like a moving island. To the Japanese public, she would soon become a source of pride, a floating promise of safety. But to the few who understood the truth, she was something else entirely. A gamble with fate. For in the very year Yamato was launched, the world of warfare had already changed. In Europe, German bombers leveled cities from the sky. In the Pacific, American carriers were evolving into the true masters of the sea. Yamato's guns could obliterate anything within 25 miles, but aircraft could strike from hundreds. Yet, none of that mattered to the men who watched her glide into the harbor that day. They believed they were witnessing the dawn of Japan's invincibility. Yamato's completion marked not just a triumph of engineering, but a declaration, one that said Japan would never again be limited by treaties or foreign powers. And yet, within her armored hull lay a cruel paradox. The very qualities that made her a masterpiece also made her obsolete. Her immense guns took minutes to reload. Her speed, impressive for her size, could not match that of a single aircraft. And her sheer bulk made her a target that could not be missed. Still, she sailed into legend before she even left port. The shipyard workers who built her described her with reverence, as though they had witnessed the birth of something divine. When she entered the water, one recalled years later, the ground shook beneath our feet. We cheered, but none of us knew we were cheering for a ghost. The secret shipyard of Kure had given birth to a miracle, but it was a miracle out of time. Born into a world that no longer believed in battleships. They called them Shin no Ho, the guns of the gods. To the men who designed them, they were more than weapons. They were sacred instruments, the embodiment of Japan's industrial genius and divine destiny. But those gods demanded a heavy price. The sheer magnitude of the guns created problems no one had foreseen. Every time Yamato's main battery fired, the recoil shook the entire ship like a miniature earthquake. Radios went silent. Each of Yamato's 9 18.1-inch cannons stood over 60 feet long and weighed hundreds of tons. The barrels gleamed like black glass under the shipyard lights, their rifled grooves machined with a precision so fine that even a hairline imperfection could mean disaster. When one of these monsters fired, the shockwave was strong enough to knock a man flat from 50 yards away. The shells, massive steel giants over 6 feet tall and weighing nearly 3,000 pounds, could travel 25 miles, their impact capable of punching through a foot of solid armor. Yet, there was beauty in the brutality. To watch them move was to witness a ballet of steel and hydraulics. Each gun turret was a fortress in itself, 3 stories tall, powered by a complex system of gears, motors, and counterbalances. The crews who would serve inside these turrets called them iron cathedrals. And in a way, they were right. The guns were temples built to worship the old gods of naval power. But those gods demanded a heavy price. The sheer magnitude of the guns created problems no one had foreseen. Every time Yamato's main battery fired, the recoil shook the entire ship like a miniature earthquake. Radios went silent. For when Yamato finally went to war, her mighty guns, those guns of the gods, would thunder in fury and achieve almost nothing. The world would learn that divinity forged in steel can still drown in the sea. Light fixtures shattered. The concussive blast could blow men off their feet even behind armored doors. During early test firings, the shockwave destroyed the ship's own reconnaissance float planes stored nearby. Engineers tried to dampen the vibration with hydraulic recoil systems and reinforced bulkheads, but it was like trying to cage a thunderstorm. The irony was bitter. The very guns meant to make Yamato invincible were also capable of tearing her apart from within. Each firing wasn't just an act of power, it was an act of self-destruction. And yet, to the Imperial Navy, this didn't matter. Strength wasn't measured in practicality anymore. It was measured in intimidation. If a single salvo could make the earth tremble, then Japan, they believed, had proven its divine right to rule the seas. When the guns were finally mounted aboard Yamato in 1941, the atmosphere among the crew was almost religious. Sailors who first laid eyes on the turrets were struck speechless. They looked alive, one recalled years later, as if they could feel the world watching. Life aboard the nearly complete battleship buzzed with ritual and pride. Crews practiced loading drills with wooden dummy shells, sweating and shouting in rhythm as they mimicked the immense choreography required to prepare a single salvo. Each shot demanded perfect timing. Cranes to hoist the shell, hydraulic arms to position it, gunners to calculate elevation, and loaders to ram it home, all while the ship rolled and pitched beneath their feet. It could take 2 minutes or more to prepare a full broadside. In theory, Yamato's guns could unleash nearly 30 tons of steel every 2 minutes. In practice, each thunderous volley was a gamble, a moment when the ship itself trembled on the edge of collapse. But inside those gun turrets, men felt invincible. They called their guns the voice of the Emperor. When the barrels roared, they believed the world would listen. And yet, even as Yamato's guns stood ready, their purpose was already vanishing into the past. Across the Pacific, American engineers were building a new kind of weapon, not a cannon, but a carrier deck. Aircraft could travel faster, strike farther, and hit harder than any battleship's guns ever could. The lessons of the Spanish Civil War and the Royal Navy's attack on Taranto had already proven that the future of naval warfare belonged to the skies. But in Tokyo's naval command, faith in the old ways held firm. Admirals who had built their careers on the doctrine of the decisive battle refused to yield. "Airplanes cannot sink battleships," they insisted. "A sword cannot slay a mountain." Yamato was that mountain. Immense, immovable, seemingly eternal. But mountains too can fall. The very weapons that made her divine would one day betray her. For when Yamato finally went to war, her mighty guns, those guns of the gods, would thunder in fury and achieve almost nothing. The world would learn that divinity forged in steel can still drown in the sea. They called her Hotel Yamato. At first it was a joke, a teasing nickname whispered in the mess halls by sailors stationed on smaller, grimier ships. But like most jokes, it carried a sting of truth. While destroyers and cruisers battled across the Pacific, the great Yamato sat anchored in the relative safety of home waters, her decks spotless, her steel shining. She had been built for glory, but she lived in waiting. Her cabins were spacious by naval standards, her corridors cool with air conditioning, a luxury almost unheard of in the Imperial fleet. The crew slept in bunk beds rather than hammocks, ate freshly cooked rice and pickled vegetables, and listened to music played through the ship's intercom. Compared to the exhaustion and deprivation on the front lines, life aboard Yamato felt like another world. It was like serving aboard a palace, one sailor would later recall. We all knew it couldn't last. Each morning began the same way. The ship's loudspeakers crackled to life with the national anthem, followed by the call to muster. Sailors formed lines on the gleaming deck as officers walked past with quiet authority. Below deck, engineers checked turbines, electricians monitored power levels, and cooks prepared breakfast for more than 3,000 men. The Yamato was a city of its own, self-contained, meticulously organized, and almost eerily calm. But beneath that order lay tension. Many of the younger sailors, barely out of training, longed for action. They had joined the Navy to fight for the Emperor, not to polish brass in an anchored fortress. Older crewmen, veterans of earlier campaigns, understood what the silence meant. Yamato was too precious to risk. She wasn't a warship anymore. She was a symbol, a psychological weapon meant to remind the nation that Japan still possessed its guardian. And so, day after day, she waited. Her mighty guns never fired, her engines rarely roared. The ocean lapped softly against her hull as the world beyond burned. In late 1942, word reached the crew that Japan had lost 4 carriers at Midway. The decisive battle, the glorious clash that Yamato had been built for, had come and gone without her. She had sat hundreds of miles away while the heart of the fleet was destroyed. The loss hit like a ghostly wave. Officers tried to keep morale high, emphasizing duty and patience. But the truth was impossible to ignore. The age of the battleship was ending, and the crew could feel it. When Yamato finally went to sea again, it was not to strike, but to serve as the flagship for Admiral Yamamoto, the very man who had designed the Pearl Harbor attack. Even then, she stayed far behind the front lines, too slow, too fuel-hungry, too valuable to risk. Her great guns, meant to decide the fate of nations, remained silent. Sailors joked darkly that the only thing Yamato ever killed was time. And yet, the pride never fully faded. They still believed, somewhere deep down, that when the day came, when the decisive battle truly arrived, Yamato would awaken, and all of Japan would stand behind her thunder. As months turned into years, life aboard the floating fortress became surreal. Letters from home arrived less frequently. Supplies grew tighter. Rumors spread of air raids over Tokyo, of cities burning, of carrier planes striking Japanese harbors. And still, the great ship floated, her guns polished, her decks immaculate. Sailors passed the time writing poetry, playing cards, or gazing out at the endless horizon, wondering if their lives would end out there one day. Some began to see the ship herself as alive, an enormous, slumbering guardian spirit bound to them all. They whispered to her before sleeping, touching her cold steel for luck. "She will protect us," they said. But as 1944 dawned, the sea itself began to feel hostile. The once proud Imperial Navy was shrinking, hunted relentlessly by American submarines and aircraft. Fuel was rationed so severely that Yamato rarely left port at all. She was still the largest, most heavily armed warship in the world, but in a cruel twist of fate, she had become a prisoner of her own greatness. She was too big to hide, too slow to run, and too important to risk. And so the myth of invincibility turned inward, becoming something darker, a kind of quiet resignation. The men aboard her learned to live between hope and futility, between pride and dread. They called her Hotel Yamato, half in jest, half in faith. But behind the laughter they knew the truth. A ship built to change the course of history had been reduced to a monument, anchored in place while the war moved on without her. Some nights, as the sun set over Cure Harbor, sailors would climb to the top deck and stare into the horizon. In the distance, the faint orange glow of distant fires painted the sky, Japan's empire burning. And in the cool night air, amid the hum of idle engines, the sound of waves lapping against steel, one question echoed silently among them. What good is a guardian that never leaves its post? For nearly 3 years, Yamato had waited, her guns cleaned and polished, her crew drilled to perfection, her legend growing louder than her engines. When the day finally came for her to fight, it wasn't with the glorious triumph her creators imagined. It was desperation that brought her to sea. The autumn of 1944 found Japan reeling. Its once proud empire was collapsing, its fleets shattered, its skies swarming with American aircraft. The U.S. had seized the Marianas, bombed the Philippines, and was closing in on the homeland. The decisive battle, that mythical Kai Kessen the Japanese Navy had built its entire doctrine around, had arrived at last, but under the worst possible circumstances. The plan was bold, even beautiful in its arrogance. Draw the American fleet into the Leyte Gulf, trap it between converging Japanese forces, and destroy it in one cataclysmic strike. Yamato would finally fire her mighty guns, the guns of the gods, in defense of a dying empire. Officers briefed their men with solemn pride. "The eyes of the emperor are upon you," they said. And for the first time, Yamato sailed into open battle. On October 25, 1944, the sea off Samar lay quiet beneath a pale sky streaked with morning light. That calm lasted only minutes. Yamato and the rest of Vice Admiral Kurita's center force had slipped through the San Bernardino Strait and were now bearing down on a small American escort group, Task Unit 77.4.3, codenamed Taffy 3. It was supposed to be an easy kill. Yamato faced light carriers, destroyers, and escort ships, a fleet so outgunned it was laughable. Her gunners prepared for the kill, confident that one broadside would wipe their enemies from the ocean. The order came. "Main battery! Open fire!" A deep rumble echoed through her hull as her 9 colossal guns elevated and locked on target. Then the earth seemed to split open, a thunderclap like the sky itself breaking apart. Massive shells, each the weight of a small car, hurtled across 20 miles of open sea. Columns of water erupted around the American ships. Sailors on those decks could only stare in awe at the size of the explosions. One recalled later, "The splashes were like mountains rising from the sea." But when the water fell back, the ships were still there. Yamato's first salvo, the most powerful ever fired in naval history, had missed entirely. What followed was chaos. The small American destroyers, Johnston, Hull, Harriman, charged forward, belching smoke, firing torpedoes, fighting like cornered wolves. Yamato's massive guns could barely track them. They were too fast, too small, darting through smoke and rain squalls. Every time her gunners adjusted, the targets vanished again. She fired salvo after salvo on more than 360 shells in total, and hit nothing. The ship built to annihilate fleets couldn't even destroy a handful of escort carriers. Her enormous guns took too long to reload. Her fire control couldn't keep up with the agile dance of the American destroyers. Meanwhile, the enemy's aircraft, tiny by comparison, swooped and strafed, dropping bombs that pinged harmlessly off her thick armor but tore apart her smaller escorts. The sea turned into a maelstrom of smoke, fire, and courage. From Yamato's bridge, officers watched the impossible unfold. Destroyers a fraction of their size charging headlong into the jaws of the greatest battleship ever built. One officer muttered under his breath, "They are not human." Another, stunned, simply whispered, "How can such small ships be so brave?" As the hours dragged on, the humiliation deepened. Yamato's own fire was deafening, yet ineffective. The overpressure from each salvo shattered instruments, deafened crewmen, and disabled radios. Her float planes, meant for reconnaissance, were torn apart by her own shock waves. Every shot hurt her more than her enemies. When Admiral Kurita realized his fleet was taking heavy losses for no gain, he gave the order to withdraw. The decisive battle, the one Japan had waited 2 decades to fight, was over before it began. Yamato's guns fell silent, their barrels hot and blackened from the futile barrage. The crew stood in stunned silence. They had unleashed the might of the gods and hit nothing but the sea. On the American side, sailors aboard the battered escort carriers watched in disbelief as the giant enemy ships retreated. They had faced the world's largest battleship and survived. Later, one U.S. officer would describe it simply, "It was like watching Goliath trip over his own feet." When Yamato limped back into port, she was still unscarred, her armor untouched, but her spirit was broken. The myth of invincibility was gone. The ship that symbolized Japan's pride had proven powerless against smaller, faster, more adaptive enemies. For the first time, her crew began to whisper openly that perhaps the admirals had been wrong all along. The battleship era was over, and Yamato had just proven it. Yet the Imperial Navy refused to admit defeat. Orders were given to repair, refuel, and prepare for what they called the next opportunity. But deep down, everyone knew there would be no next time. The thunder that was supposed to shake the world had missed its mark. And with it, the last illusion of Japanese supremacy at sea. Yamato was still afloat, still magnificent, but now she was something far sadder, a monument to a faith that had lost its believers. By the spring of 1945, the Pacific had turned against Japan. The empire that once dreamed of ruling Asia was now cornered, its islands smothered under clouds of American bombers. The Imperial Navy, once the pride of the Emperor, was little more than a ghost fleet. Carriers lay shattered in harbors, submarines prowled every shipping lane, and the skies no longer belonged to Japan. On the southern horizon loomed Okinawa, the last barrier before the homeland itself. The U.S. invasion had begun, and Tokyo's high command was desperate. There would be no more decisive battles, no more grand strategies. All that remained was sacrifice. From this desperation came Operation Tengo, a mission so hopeless it bordered on suicide. Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, would sail one final time. She was to charge straight into Okinawa, beach herself on the shore, and fight as a stationary fortress until destroyed. There was only enough fuel for a one-way journey. Her crew knew what that meant. None expected to return. The order came on April 5, 1945, delivered in the voice of inevitability. Officers read it aloud in the wardroom as the men sat in silence. No one spoke. Some clenched their fists. Others stared at the floor. Then, almost mechanically, they bowed and replied, "Hi." The next morning, preparations began. Ammunition was loaded, bulkheads inspected, engines checked. The sailors worked with the calm of men already dead. Many wrote farewell letters to their families, folding them carefully and sealing them in oilskin pouches. Some tucked small paper cranes into their uniforms, prayers that would never reach the shore. Chaplains moved quietly through the corridors, offering final blessings. On the deck, the great guns were polished until they shone like obsidian mirrors. "She must look beautiful when she dies," one crewman said softly. There was no bitterness in his voice, only duty. To die aboard Yamato was to die with honor. That was what they had been taught since boyhood, that the highest virtue was to fall in service to the emperor. At dawn on April 6th, Yamato slipped her moorings at Tokuyama. Her escort, one light cruiser and 8 destroyers, formed up alongside. The sea was calm, the sky pale. Fishermen along the coast watched in stunned silence as the giant ship passed, her black hull looming like a moving mountain. The sailors aboard waved, some smiling, some weeping, knowing they would never see land again. To them, the mission wasn't suicide. It was sacrifice, a gesture meant to inspire those who still fought. Radio broadcasts would later call it a glorious charge. But aboard Yamato, the mood was heavy. The engines rumbled through the night, burning the last of Japan's precious fuel. As the convoy pushed south, American reconnaissance planes spotted them. Within hours, reports reached Admiral Raymond Spruance's fleet. Large Japanese force heading toward Okinawa. Orders went out to intercept. 11 carriers prepared for battle. Over 400 planes, Avengers, Helldivers, Corsairs, armed and ready. The hunters had found their prey. The next morning, April 7th, the sky above the East China Sea was gray and restless. Yamato's lookouts spotted the first enemy aircraft just before noon. Alarms blared through the ship. Men rushed to battle stations. Anti-aircraft guns swiveled skyward. The giant ship began to maneuver, cutting white arcs through the water. The first wave of American planes came screaming in low, torpedo bombers. The air filled with the rattle of machine gun fire and the thunder of explosions. Yamato's 25mm cannons spat fire, tracers streaking into the clouds. Some planes fell burning into the sea, but more came, dozens at a time. Torpedoes streaked toward her flanks. The battleship heeled hard to port, trying to evade. One struck, then another. The shock was like being hit by a mountain. Inside, men were thrown from their feet. Compartments flooded instantly. Damage crews raced through smoke-filled corridors, sealing hatches, dragging hoses, shouting over the roar of fire and steam. Above deck, sailors kept firing even as shrapnel ripped through their ranks. One gunner, bleeding from a head wound, refused to leave his post. "Keep shooting," he yelled. "Keep shooting until she sinks." Wave after wave came. Dive bombers howled from the clouds, their bombs slamming into Yamato's armored deck with terrible precision. The entire ship shook with every hit. Fires roared through the gun turrets. Ammunition lockers threatened to explode. The sky and sea blurred into a single storm of smoke and flame. Officers tried to maintain order, shouting commands through the din. Captain Kosaku Ariga remained on the bridge, calm amid chaos. When another torpedo tore open the port side, Yamato began to list dangerously. Water poured into the lower decks. Men below shouted as the lights flickered and died. By 2 p.m., the ship was mortally wounded. Still, her guns thundered upward, firing blindly into the sky, desperate, defiant. Then the end came swiftly. At 2:23 p.m., her forward magazine ignited. The explosion was apocalyptic, a fireball rising 6 kilometers high, visible from the Japanese mainland. The shockwave flattened nearby destroyers. In an instant, over 3,000 souls were gone. The sea boiled with flame and oil. Survivors clung to debris, their faces blackened by smoke. One later said, "The sea was on fire and the sky was falling." As the last echoes of the explosion faded, the waves closed over Yamato's grave. Of the 332 men who had sailed with her, only 276 survived. The greatest battleship ever built had vanished in less than 2 hours. To the Americans who watched from above, it was awe-inspiring, a titanic symbol of the old world dying before their eyes. To Japan, it was silence. News of the sinking was hushed. Newspapers called it a heroic sacrifice, but everyone knew the truth. Yamato had been sent to die, and she had not taken the enemy with her. In that moment, the age of the battleship ended forever. The mighty guns, the towering armor, the doctrine of decisive battle, all had been swept aside by wings and will. And beneath the waves of the East China Sea, amid the twisted steel and the drifting paper cranes, the pride of an empire lay broken. The one-way mission was over. When the sea finally closed over Yamato, the sound lingered, a long, low moan, as though the ocean itself mourned. In that moment, the greatest battleship ever built became a tomb. More than 3,000 men, sailors, officers, cooks, mechanics, friends, vanished beneath the black water, their final cries swallowed by the deep. Those who survived floated amid wreckage and oil, watching the flames die slowly on the horizon. The air smelled of smoke and salt and death. It was as if the sun had fallen into the sea, one survivor later said. The sky burned red, and then there was nothing. Around them drifted fragments of the ship that had once embodied an empire's pride. Twisted steel, splintered lifeboats, and pieces of paper from letters that would never be read. For hours, American aircraft circled above, making sure the giant was truly gone. Below, Yamato lay broken in two, her hull split by the force of her own explosion. The ocean had claimed its prize, and with it, the last illusion of Japanese invincibility. The news of her destruction reached Tokyo 2 days later. There were no announcements, no parades of mourning, just silence. In the War Ministry, officials bowed their heads. They had poured their nation's hope, pride, and dwindling resources into that ship, and now she lay scattered across the seafloor. Yamato was supposed to be Japan's guardian, the embodiment of divine protection. Instead, she had become a symbol of futility, a monument to arrogance and despair. Newspapers published a few short articles calling her final mission heroic, but the words felt hollow. Even civilians who knew nothing of naval warfare could sense the truth. Japan's guardian was gone, and the war was lost. Across the country, families received terse telegrams marked with a black border. "We regret to inform you that your son has died in battle." In fishing villages and small towns, women wept quietly, holding photographs of sons who had never returned. The pride that once fueled the empire now curdled into grief. For the Imperial Navy, Yamato's loss was more than symbolic. It was catastrophic. 2 battleships of her class, enough steel and labor to build 6 aircraft carriers and 1,000 planes, had achieved almost nothing. The doctrine that had guided Japan's naval strategy for decades, the belief in the decisive battle, had proven fatally outdated. Air power had rewritten the rules. It wasn't the ship with the biggest guns or thickest armor that ruled the seas anymore. It was the one that could strike first, from farthest away. Yamato's shells cost $50,000 apiece. The torpedoes that sank her cost a fraction of that. Her guns could reach 25 miles, but the planes that destroyed her came from hundreds. The contrast was merciless and absolute. In military academies across the world, strategists would later study her fate as a turning point, the moment when technology and doctrine parted ways. The Leviathan had fallen not because she was weak, but because the world around her had changed faster than she could. Yet, for all its tragedy, the fall of Yamato carried a strange dignity. The men who died aboard her weren't fools or fanatics. They were sailors doing their duty, caught in the machinery of history. In their final hours, many showed extraordinary courage. Some stayed at their guns until the very end. Others helped wounded comrades escape while the decks tilted and the fires raged. Captain Kosaku Ariga, standing on the bridge as the ship rolled, refused to leave. He gave the order to abandon ship, then saluted the rising sun and went down with his command. Survivors would later speak of his calm, how he stood amid the chaos as though carved from stone. His body was never found. For those few who lived, survival felt like a curse. They had witnessed the death of their brothers, their ship, and their nation's pride all in one moment. In interviews years later, their voices still trembled when they spoke of it. "We were supposed to protect her," one said, "but in the end, she protected us, by dying first." The fall of the Leviathan was not just a naval disaster. It was the end of an idea. For centuries, nations had built bigger ships, stronger guns, thicker armor, each generation trying to outmatch the last. Yamato had been the pinnacle of that evolution, the summit of human ambition in steel, and her destruction proved that the summit was also the edge of the cliff. When the fireball rose into the sky on April 7, 1945, it marked the death of the battleship era. Never again would such giants rule the seas. From that day on, power would rest not in the size of the ship, but in the reach of its aircraft, the precision of its intelligence, and the adaptability of its mind. The age of titans had ended, and the world had entered the age of innovation. Beneath the waves of the East China Sea, Yamato still rests, her guns silent, her decks buried in darkness. A colossal reminder that pride, no matter how vast, cannot float forever. Today, the Yamato sleeps beneath 200 feet of cold Pacific water. Her once proud hull lies torn and scattered across the seabed, draped in coral and silence. Fish swim through twisted corridors where sailors once marched. Her mighty guns, once symbols of national pride, now lie half buried in sand, their barrels pointing into the endless dark. Time has softened her edges, but not her story. Every rivet, every shattered plate of steel, whispers of ambition, sacrifice, and the terrible beauty of human endeavor. Divers who have visited the wreck describe it as haunting. "It's like visiting a cathedral," one said, "a place where gods once lived." Because in a way, Yamato was never just a ship, she was a mirror, reflecting both the glory and the folly of the age that built her. In the decades after the war, Japan's relationship with Yamato became complicated. To some, she was a cautionary tale, a symbol of arrogance and blindness, proof that pride without foresight leads only to ruin. To others, she became something more sacred, a vessel of memory, a reminder of the courage and humanity of those who served aboard her. In 1985, when Japanese researchers finally located her wreck, survivors wept, not out of renewed grief, but out of peace. "She's not lost anymore," one said. "She's home." Memorials sprang up across Japan, in Kure, in Hiroshima, in the cities that built her. Each one told the story not of a failed weapon, but of the people behind it. Engineers who worked by lamplight, sailors who died with honor, families who waited for letters that never came. Over time, Yamato's name began to heal. The word itself, Yamato, drawn from Japan's ancient name, came to symbolize not defeat but endurance. Outside Japan, historians saw her differently. To Western scholars, Yamato was the last gasp of a dying era, the final monument to a philosophy that mistook size for strength. Military strategists studied her as a lesson in technological hubris. They noted how her immense guns, magnificent on paper, were useless against enemies she could not see. They pointed out the irony that while Japan invested its soul into one ship, the United States invested its resources into adaptability, into carriers, radar, and air power. The results were clear, but even in their analysis, many could not help but feel awe. Because Yamato represented something beyond logic, the human urge to create the ultimate, to defy limits, to build something so vast that it feels immortal. In that way, she belongs not just to Japan, but to history itself, a monument to what we dare to dream and what we too often forget to question. For the survivors who lived on, Yamato never truly sank. They carried her with them, in memory, in guilt, in pride. Some spent decades unable to speak of that day. Others wrote memoirs, their words trembling between horror and reverence. Many described the ship not as a machine, but as a living being, a guardian spirit that had watched over them until the end. When she went down, one survivor said, it felt like losing a friend. That connection, between man and steel, between myth and mortality, is what keeps her story alive even now. In films, novels, and museums, Yamato's image endures, not as a weapon, but as a question. How far will we go in pursuit of greatness? How much are we willing to sacrifice for pride? And do we ever truly learn from the wreckage we leave behind? In the end, Yamato's legacy is not measured in tons of steel or caliber of guns, but in the lessons she carved into history. She reminds us that technology without wisdom is a dangerous god, that power must evolve, or it will be consumed by its own shadow. She reminds us, too, of the men who served not for glory, but for duty, who fought bravely even when the cause had already been lost. And perhaps most importantly, she reminds us that even in destruction, there can be dignity. The sea that took her did not erase her. It preserved her, turning her from a weapon into a warning, from a fortress into a story. Today, when divers descend into the dark and brush their hands across the steel that once shook the earth, they are not touching defeat. They are touching history. The Leviathan sleeps, but her echoes still rise. In every wave that rolls across the Pacific, in every reminder that pride, unchecked, can drown even the strongest among us. Because Yamato was never just the story of a ship that sank. She was, and remains, the story of us.